What's going on in New York City? A lot, but one of them is some suspected terrorists are dressing up as tourists. Should we be worried? Joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Michael Rubin, the Iran expert at the American Enterprise Institute. Now, what is this about tourists from Iran being suspected plotting a terrorist plot? First of all, how do you know they're possibly tourists and not just terrorists? Give me the facts, Michael.
Well, it seems that Iranians posing as tourists, at least some of them, were taking video and photos of things that sometimes tourists simply wouldn't be taking photos of. Heliports, railroad tracks, and so forth. And so they were detained, they were questioned, and some of them, it seemed, just their stories didn't add up. It looked like they were surveying the area for a possible terrorist attack.
Now, how recently did this happen, and are they still in custody?
I don't know their custody status right now. It's happened over the last several months. One thing that worries me, however, is Iranians don't just go to New York. Under the Obama administration, for the first time, Iranian diplomats who traditionally have been limited to 25 miles a radius around New York City have been allowed to come down to Washington, D.C. and go elsewhere in the United States. And that means that instead of just surveying the area immediately around Washington, D.C., at least with some of these guys who may have had diplomatic passports, they could have been going farther and wider.
Oh, so you're saying these weren't just people posing as tourists. These were actually people with diplomatic passports who were here as part of the embassy?
No, what I'm saying is that some of the people that were detained in New York were posing as tourists, but it would be logical to assume, and this has been the problem with security in the past, with the former Libyan embassy, with the former Iraqi embassy, with the Cuban embassy, and so forth, if it's not just a matter of tourists coming and doing this, but also if they're getting some sort of diplomatic assistance once they're here. We know from a number of different sources over the years that the Iranians have had some cells here or tried to develop some cells here. Remember, there was also an Iranian attempt at a terrorist attack in Washington, D.C. that was wrapped up just through the sheer incompetence of one of the Iranian agents. But it certainly looks like, at the very least, the Iranians are creating a scenario for retaliation should the conflict between the United States and Tehran heat up considerably.
Now, tell me your expertise in Iran. Before we came on air, you said you actually lived in Iran and you speak Farsi. How did you manage that? I didn't know Westerners could. Was this before? I mean, surely you're not old enough to have been there before the Ayatollahs. Tell me your background a little bit.
No, this was during the Islamic Revolution. I did my PhD on 19th century Iranian history, which was good enough to be completely unemployed when I got finished in the years before 9/11. But I was doing dissertation research over in Iran. They used to call me in Persian Pasari Shaitani Bozorg, or son of the great Satan. And then subsequent to that, and after 9/11, I started working for the Pentagon as the Iran desk officer, country director. And so I've been able to combine the academic interest in Iran, living in Iran, with understanding some of the policy concerns that the Americans have.
Now, given your facility in Farsi, you probably are privy to information about grassroots Iranians and what they might be saying or doing. I have heard it said that the Iranian regime is unpopular with the people, and that there may even be a way to have a change in that country from the grassroots up. Is that just a pipe dream, or do you detect, for example, on blogs or the equivalent, that there is a general unrest and dissatisfaction in that country itself?
Well, you know, most Iranians don't like their regime. They're quite apathetic. I always try to keep my my ear to the ground for local humor, and don't worry, this one is actually clean enough for television. But the Iranians will tell a joke about an Iranian woman who's getting married. On her wedding night, she tells her husband, "I probably should have told you this before, but this is my second marriage." Husband gets all surprised, and she says, no, don't worry, I'm still a virgin." Well, how can that be? My first husband was like the Iranian president, the former reformist Mohammad Khatami. He kept promising to do it, promising to do it, promising to do it, and after 8 years he didn't touch a thing. But they're not revolutionary because last time they had a revolution to get rid of a dictator, which is what they have now, they ended up with a war that killed up to 1 million people. And so most Iranians are simply concentrating on feeding their families, and the economy in Iran is pretty much a sinkhole. So that's problem number one. The other problem here is that it doesn't matter what ordinary Iranians think. Until the Revolutionary Guard, this elite Praetorian Guard, switches sides, ultimately there's not going to be regime change. Fundamentally, what the question we need to ask is, how can we fracture that revolutionary guard? Because it's that revolutionary guard that protects the 10%, which is suppressing the rest of this beautiful country of 70 million people.
Dr. Rubin, let's bring it back to New York and Washington. And I mean, we know that Iran has a longer reach. They're working with Venezuela's Hugo Chavez. They were implicated through Hezbollah in the bombing in Buenos Aires. How likely is it that they have people in place in the United States waiting for the go signal to explode bombs, shoot up Jewish schools in retaliation for a war in Iran? Do you think that this is likely, if not these particular detainees, but others throughout America? Do you think there are sleeper cells in America and maybe even in Canada right now?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, about 12 or 15 years ago, we wrapped up a Hezbollah cell. That was Hezbollah, of course, being an Iranian proxy that was involved in cigarette smuggling to Canada. Certainly, if you can have a smuggling cell, you can have another cell. You brought up the 1994 Buenos Aires bombing. One of the people who was an organizer for that and for whom there's an Interpol red notice out is the Iranian defense minister, the current one, Ahmed Vahidi. Now, when he was working on that bombing in Buenos Aires in 1994, he was working a great deal with drug smugglers in the Triangle border area where Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay come together. Now, when we go to the more recent plot, allegedly in Washington, D.C., to assassinate the Saudi ambassador, a lot of people raised their eyebrows about why the Iranians would be working with drug smugglers. But back in 1994, for that Buenos Aires attack, they most certainly did. And the other thing to remember, this isn't the only country, Canada and the United States, which have to be wary of Iranian sleeper cells right now. We know for a fact that Iranian sleeper cells were involved in a 1992 assassination in Berlin, Germany. And recently, the Kuwaitis have rolled up an Iranian sleeper cell that was trying to conduct a terror attack on the southern Kuwaiti oil field. So certainly this seems to be the asymmetric strategy of choice among the Iranian intelligence community.
Dr. Michael Rubin of American Enterprise Institute, we've got to have you back on the show. Your knowledge of the counterintelligence cat and mouse game is so deep. We've got to talk about it again on the show. Thanks for spending time with us today.
Thanks for having me.